Thomas M. Ray wasn't the kind of man who asked for recognition. He had worn the uniform through two wars, Korea and Vietnam, and had returned home not with parades but with silence. Not with medals on display, but with quiet shoulders that had carried more than their share. He didn't talk much about the past. That wasn't his way. Men like Tom Ray didn't serve for attention. They served because they believed in something bigger than themselves. That Tuesday morning, he wasn't looking for sympathy or applause. He didn't come to flash credentials or relive memories of war. All Tom wanted, what brought him to High Point Federal Bank, was to withdraw a modest amount from an old military account he'd opened decades ago. The same account that held deposits from hardship tours and classified deployments that had never made the evening news. This time it was to help his grandson with tuition. Tom dressed carefully that morning. His shirt was ironed, his slacks plain but clean. His jacket, though worn at the seams, had been brushed off with care. On his head, he wore a black cap embroidered in gold thread, Korea-Vietnam veteran. The lettering had faded over the years, but it still held its pride. In his inner coat pocket were papers aged, frayed but official, 2 discharge forms, a VA card, and one more thing, a challenge coin. Small brass and almost forgotten by time. Not something you buy, something you earn. He stepped through the glass doors of the bank, quietly holding his cap in one hand like a man entering sacred ground. No rush, no fuss, just purpose. And here's where the story begins. Not with fanfare or flags, but with a man who simply wanted to keep a promise. Because sometimes the most extraordinary people are the ones who ask for nothing and still deserve everything. If you believe that service to this country never expires, then this story is for you. And if you think men like Thomas M. Ray should never be forgotten, comment "Honored" below to show your respect, and subscribe to the channel to help us keep their stories alive. What happens next may stay with you long after the final word is spoken. Tom Ray had waited his turn like he always did, patiently, quietly, as if the simple act of standing in line still meant something. When he reached the counter, he offered the teller a small, polite smile. She couldn't have been more than 25, with a fresh name tag and a keyboard rhythm that said she'd been there just long enough to feel confident. But as soon as she typed in his information and glanced at the screen, her brow furrowed. She looked back at Tom, at the name on the ID, and then again at the aged documents he had carefully unfolded for her. There was hesitation, not cruelty, not yet, just unfamiliarity. She leaned slightly to the side, then gave a small wave toward the glass office near the back. That's when Dylan Mercer entered the story. The bank manager, mid-30s, pressed suit-tight haircut, walked with the kind of authority that came more from posture than purpose. He approached the counter like he had somewhere better to be. Tom nodded politely and offered his documents again. Discharge forms with yellowed edges, a VA card faded from years of wear, and the same unwavering calm in his voice. "This account goes back a ways," Tom said. "Just need to access some of what's mine." Dylan took one look at the paperwork and chuckled. Typed on a dinosaur, he muttered loud enough for others to hear. "Sir," he added with a smirk, drawing out the word like a punchline. "Are you sure this account belongs to you?" The teller gave a nervous laugh. Tom didn't react. Instead, he reached slowly into his coat and placed a small object on the counter, a brass challenge coin, its surface worn smooth by time, engraved with a symbol no civilian would recognize, but any real soldier would never forget. Dylan didn't even glance at it. "Cute trinket," he said. "You can get stuff like that on eBay nowadays." Then with a dismissive flick of his hand, he turned to the nearby security guard. "I think we've got another wannabe vet trying to work the system. Escort him out, please." The words weren't shouted. They didn't need to be. They carried something worse than volume dismissal. The kind of quiet accusation that robs dignity before it ever raises a voice. Tom looked down at the coin, then picked it up with steady fingers and tucked it back into his coat. He said nothing, no protest, no demand. But the room had changed. Other customers glanced over. A few exchanged uneasy looks. One person chuckled behind a phone screen, too entertained to care. And just like that, a man who had once commanded the respect of nations was treated like a fraud in a building that wouldn't even exist had it not been for men like him. But Tom Ray didn't storm out. He simply stepped aside and sat down by the window. Because sometimes the strongest protest is silence. And sometimes silence speaks louder than anything else in the room. Stay with us. Because this moment, this insult wasn't the end. It was the spark. Tom Ray didn't argue, He didn't raise his voice. He didn't defend his name or his service, or the folded papers still trembling faintly in the teller's hand. Instead, he gathered his belongings with slow, deliberate care, the way you'd close a chapter you'd read too many times to be surprised by the ending. Then, without a single word, he turned and walked toward a small wooden bench near the bank's front window. He lowered himself slowly, rested his hands on the head of his cane, and stared quietly through the glass. Outside, the American flag danced in the wind. Inside, the air changed. Moments earlier, the bank had buzzed with quiet conversation, the soft tapping of keyboards, the murmur of small talk, and routine transactions. Now everything felt heavier. Not with guilt, not yet, but with something colder: discomfort. A few customers chuckled under their breath, unsure of what exactly was funny, but somehow amused all the same. One man near the coffee station pulled out his phone, pretending to scroll his screen, reflecting more interest in recording drama than stopping it. Others avoided looking altogether. A woman in a gray blazer shifted in her seat and stared hard at her feet. A young man by the ATM cleared his throat, glanced at Tom, then quickly turned away. No one said a word, not to him, not to each other, because silence makes it easier to ignore what we don't want to see. And still Tom sat, back straight, chin level, face unreadable. There was no trace of anger in him, no sign of hurt, just the stillness of someone who'd learned long ago how to wait with dignity, even when the world forgot how to offer it. To anyone else, he might have looked like just another old man killing time. But those who looked closely, those who dared to really see, would have noticed the unmistakable presence of someone who had once carried command, now sitting unnoticed in a room he should have commanded still. It wasn't just a man on a bench, it was a message left unspoken. And if anyone in that building had paused, really paused, they might have felt it, the shift. Because somewhere deep in that stillness, the mood had changed. The laughter didn't echo as loudly now. The whispers weren't so sure. And what had moments ago seemed like a harmless joke now lingered in the air like something sour. Tom Ray didn't need to speak to reclaim his place. He just had to sit and let the room remember what it had chosen to forget. And soon, someone would. Stay with us. The silence wouldn't last much longer. The room was still, but not quiet in the way a bank should be. It was the kind of silence that hums beneath your skin. The kind that follows after something has gone wrong, but before anyone's willing to admit it. Most people looked away. But not Elena Tran. She'd been sitting near the rear of the lobby, a tablet in her lap, waiting for a business meeting upstairs. She wasn't dressed in uniform anymore, but something in her bearing still suggested disciplined structure and readiness. A posture that doesn't fade even after the uniform is folded and put away. Elena Tran wasn't just another customer. She was a former Air Force logistics officer, now working in defense contracting. 10 years active duty, 2 overseas tours, and countless strategic briefings under her belt. She'd moved from the battlefield to the boardroom, but her instincts, they were as sharp as ever. And when she saw the coin on the counter when Tom had placed it there, humble and deliberate, she had recognized it instantly. Not from a movie, not from a replica, from real life. Years ago, while stationed at Fort Sheridan, Elena had been part of a classified logistics review. During one of the briefings, a visiting colonel had walked in unannounced, no fanfare. When he placed that exact same kind of coin on the table, the room of hardened officers stood without hesitation. No orders, no words, because they knew exactly what that coin meant. And now here it was again, ignored and mocked by a bank manager who thought he was dealing with just another senior citizen with a story too old to matter. Elena's jaw tightened. She stood. Her heels echoed as she walked toward the counter, not rushed, not confrontational, but with purpose. When she arrived, she didn't speak to the teller. She looked directly at Dylan Mercer, still leaning smugly on the edge of the counter, still proud of the way he'd handled the situation. "You just made a mistake," Elena said, her voice low but sharp enough to draw every nearby ear. Dylan blinked. "Excuse me." She didn't flinch. Instead, she pointed calmly across the room to where Tom sat, his gaze still focused out the window. "That man isn't a fraud. That coin alone outranks every paycheck in this building." Dylan scoffed. "If he's so important, where's his entourage? Why is he sitting there all alone?" Elena didn't answer. She didn't need to. She turned and stepped outside the glass doors, pulled out her phone, and dialed a number from memory, a contact she'd only ever used once before. The call rang twice. "Command Operations Fort Sheridan," came the voice. Elena didn't hesitate. This is Elena Tran. I need to verify a bishop-level identification code matches to a Thomas M. Ray. He's here. At High Point Federal, I need confirmation. There was a pause, a long one, then a shift in tone on the other end. You say Colonel Ray is there now? Yes, she replied, sitting alone. He's just been dismissed by a bank manager who didn't know what that coin meant. The line went quiet again. Then came the answer. Do not let him leave. Something had just been set in motion, something big. And back inside the lobby, Dylan Mercer had no idea who he'd just laughed out the door. But Elena Tron did, and she wasn't about to let this story end like that. Stay with us. Justice was already on its way. Not everyone in a High Point Federal Bank had forgotten. In a quiet office tucked behind frosted glass near the back of the building, Samuel Dwyer sat hunched over a stack of reconciliation reports. He was in his early 60s, glasses perched halfway down his nose, gray hair thinning, and his tie just slightly askew. Most people at the bank didn't know his title, not because he didn't have one, but because he'd been there so long that he didn't need one. He was just Sam, the kind of man who knew every inch of the building, who remembered which printers always jammed, which light flickered above the conference room, and where the plumbing groaned in winter. He'd worked at High Point Federal longer than most of the staff had been alive. He rarely spoke unless something needed to be said, and this moment needed something. Sam hadn't seen the incident at the counter unfold, but he had heard the name Thomas M. Ray spoken just loudly enough as the teller tried to explain herself to Dylan. It echoed faintly through the hallway and slipped into Sam's office like a breeze through a cracked window. He froze. He pushed back from his desk slowly and stood. The name stirred something, a memory half forgotten but never erased. He walked past the file cabinets and out into the main corridor, following the echo of that name like a thread pulling him towards something that had always been there. At the far end of the lobby in a corner, most people passed by without a glance, hung a brass dedication plaque. It had been there since the bank's founding. Sam knew it well. He'd polished it himself every Memorial Day. The plaque commemorated the land the bank was built on, land that decades earlier had housed a military outpost, High Point Command Station. The plaque listed the names of the base's original leadership. There near the top, engraved deeper than most, was a name few ever bothered to read. Colonel T.M. Ray. Sam stared at it, the letters catching the light just enough to glint. It was him, the man sitting on the bench, the man everyone had just dismissed. And suddenly, all the tension in the air made sense. Sam didn't rush. He didn't make a scene. He simply turned, walked back into his office, closed the door, and reached under his desk. There, in a locked drawer, was a phone line only a handful of employees had ever used. Most assumed it was just there for emergencies, cyber threats, audits, high-risk transactions. But Sam knew better. He picked up the receiver, dialed a number he hadn't touched in over a decade, and waited. One ring, two, then a voice calm official alert. Operations desk, Tier 4, secure line. Identify. Sam didn't give a name. He just said 6 words. It's Bishop Coyne. High Point, he's here. And then he hung up. No further explanation, no embellishment, because that was all it took. Back out in the lobby, Tom Ray hadn't moved. Still sitting, still waiting. But now wheels were turning behind the scenes. Not out of pity, not out of obligation, but out of respect long overdue. And the people who truly knew what that coin meant, they were no longer watching from a distance. They were on their way. The story wasn't over. In fact, it had just been activated. 15 miles away, inside a high-security briefing room at Regional Command HQ, a discussion on joint force deployment strategies came to a sudden, silent halt. A classified line had just lit up, one reserved for calls that didn't ask questions, only delivered facts. The aide who answered it was seasoned, sharp, and rarely shaken. But when he heard the 6 words, "It's Bishop Coyne, High Point, he's here," his expression changed instantly. He crossed the room and leaned in close to the commanding officer seated at the head of the table. "Sir," he said quietly, "it's Colonel Thomas M. Ray. He's surfaced. High Point Federal." At first, Major General Jonathan Hale didn't move. The name echoed in his head like a forgotten cadence. A name not just from the past, but from his own foundation as a soldier. Tom Ray wasn't a footnote. He wasn't a story passed down through rumor or romanticism. He was the doctrine. The man whose field reports were required reading at West Point. The one whose improvisations in the jungle had rewritten the manuals, whose leadership in unacknowledged conflicts had saved lives that history books would never count. And now, someone had dared to question him. The general stood up so abruptly his chair rolled back without a sound. Everyone else in the room followed instinctively back straight, breath held. "Suit up," he said to his aide. "We're leaving. Now." No one asked why. Because they knew when a man like Ray resurfaces, you don't delay. You respond. Within minutes, a black government-issued SUV rolled out from a secured motor pool. Inside, Hale sat in full-dress uniform, every medal, every ribbon, every razor-sharp crease in place. Not for show, but for respect. His face, usually composed with a tactician's calm, now carried something rare fury held tightly under control. Not because Tom Ray had been disrespected, but because he had been forgotten, even for a moment. As the city blurred past the windows, Hale remained silent, but his mind was full. He remembered the day he first read a tactical analysis authored by then-Colonel Ray. He remembered how it challenged every convention, every protocol, and how it worked anyway. He remembered the whispered references in closed-door briefings. If Ray wrote it, you follow it. He owed his stars to the example of that man. And now that same man had been asked if he even belonged. That was going to change. High Point Federal Bank had made a mistake, and a storm was on its way, not with noise or headlines, but with honor wrapped in silence. "Stay with us." The salute heard around that lobby was coming. Back at High Point, Federal time had begun to drag. The fluorescent lights above cast a pale glow over the marble floor, and the soft hum of printers and keystrokes felt louder than it should have. The lobby, once filled with routine, was now wrapped in a hush that didn't feel peaceful. It felt tight, like everyone was waiting for something to happen, but no one dared ask what. Still seated near the window, Tom Ray hadn't moved. Same posture, same calm. His cap rested on his lap, his cane steady beneath his hands. He hadn't so much as glanced back at the counter, not out of defiance, but because men like him don't look for validation. They already know who they are. But just a few yards away, Dylan Mercer hadn't let go of the smirk. He leaned over the teller line again, scanning the room with half interest, half amusement. Still here, he muttered, clearly not realizing or perhaps refusing to accept that the energy in the room had already shifted. "He's probably hoping someone films him." Dylan scoffed to a younger employee nearby. "Posted online, spins some sob story. Veterans pull that kind of thing all the time for donations." The words hung in the air like smoke. A few people who had previously laughed now looked uneasy. One customer subtly slid their phone back into their pocket. The young teller, the same one who'd first flagged the account, sat rigidly in her chair. Her eyes stayed fixed on the screen in front of her, but her typing had stopped completely. Because now she knew. She had made a mistake. On the far side of the lobby, Elena Tran stood still, arms crossed tightly, jaw clenched. She hadn't sat back down since her call to Fort Sheridan. Her phone was still in her handscreen, dim, but she didn't need an update to know the wheels were turning. Somewhere out there, the right people were on their way, and justice had already been set in motion. But for now, all they could do was wait. And that was the most unbearable part of all. No one in the lobby spoke. Not to Tom, not to Dylan, not to each other. But the silence wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with the sound of shame unspoken, of dignity, slowly being reassembled in the stillness. People who had once looked at Tom with indifference now couldn't quite meet his eyes. Others who had scrolled past him now found themselves stealing glances just long enough to wonder what story they'd almost missed. Even the security guard, once ready to escort Tom out, now stood frozen near the door, casting uncertain glances toward the man in the flannel coat who hadn't raised his voice once, but whose presence had begun to command the entire room. The man they tried to ignore was no longer invisible, and every second that passed was making that clearer. Because deep down, everyone could feel it. Something was coming, and when it arrived, everything in that bank was going to change. The silence inside High Point Federal had become a living thing, heavy, watchful, almost sacred. Every eye in the room shifted between the man by the window and the growing weight of unspoken realization. And then the glass doors burst open, not with the casual swing of a customer or the impatient push of a delivery. This was something else entirely. Boots struck the marble floor with a sound that didn't belong in a bank. Not hurried, not aggressive, just exact. Each step was purposeful, measured echoing like the steady beat of a long-awaited answer. In walked Major General Jonathan Hale, full-dress uniform, medals gleaming in the overhead light, posture carved from discipline and steel. His entrance didn't need words. It didn't need an introduction, because from the moment he crossed the threshold, the room stood still. Conversations died mid-sentence. Fingers froze above keyboards. Even the background hum of the printers seemed to dull beneath the weight of his presence. He didn't look around. He didn't ask for directions. He already knew. Across the lobby, Tom Ray remained seated by the window, still dignified, unaware of what had just entered behind him. Hale walked straight toward him, ignoring the stares, the questions, the stunned silence. And then he stopped. 3 feet from the bench, the general squared his shoulders, brought his hand up to his brow with crisp military precision, and delivered a salute so sharp, so perfectly executed, it cut through the air like a blade. The crack of palm meeting temple was louder than any accusation that had filled the room before. Every civilian in the lobby gasped. A few instinctively stood. Dylan Mercer, who had been lounging confidently behind the teller line just moments before, looked up and froze, his smirk dissolving mid-breath. Tom, surprised by the sudden silence, turned his head and saw him. Recognition flickered in his eyes. Slowly, without a rush, without fanfare, he rose to his feet. The cane balanced easily in his left hand as he returned the salute with the grace of a soldier who never forgot how. It was a gesture decades in the making. No music played. No speeches were made. But for everyone watching, it was a moment that changed the temperature of the room forever. Because in that instant, the man they'd dismissed was now being saluted by a general in full dress in front of everyone who had doubted him. This wasn't just a correction, it was a reckoning, and the room would never forget it. Stay with us, because the truth behind that salute was about to be laid bare. The salute had landed like thunder, quiet, controlled, but undeniable. And yet General Jonathan Hale wasn't finished. He lowered his hand slowly, then turned to face the entire room. His chest squared, his voice calm, but edged with authority that needed no amplification. "Who here," he asked, pausing long enough for his words to settle, "told Colonel Thomas M. Ray he wasn't who he said he was?" No one answered, not immediately. Because when truth stands in uniform, wrapped in history and honor, even the boldest egos go silent. Dylan Mercer, still frozen behind the counter, opened his mouth, then closed it. He looked smaller now, not because of Hale's presence, but because he finally understood the magnitude of his mistake. General Hale stepped forward. "Colonel Ray," he said, turning slightly toward Tom, "was instrumental in developing operational frameworks that are still in use across 6 theaters of military engagement today." He scanned the room. His record spans 2 major wars and multiple operations so classified they don't appear in our own archives. His field decisions saved entire units. His innovations in joint force logistics are still taught at war colleges across this nation. Then from the briefcase held by his aide, Hale retrieved a small velvet box, black unmarked, sealed with a gold clasp. He opened it carefully and turned it toward Tom. Inside sat a medal, simple, elegant, heavy with meaning. Etched in the polished metal were just 3 words: "Service Beyond Record." Tom looked down at it, unmoving. No tears, no outward display, just a long, quiet breath, as if some unseen burden had finally been laid to rest. Hale extended the box with both hands, as if returning something sacred. "You never asked for this, Colonel," he said, "but your country has owed it to you for a very long time." Tom took the medal, slowly gave a small nod, and said only 4 words. "I just kept my word." And then something remarkable happened. The teller stood, then the woman near the loan office, then the man by the coffee station. One by one, every customer, every employee in the room rose to their feet. No one told them to. No one asked them to. They stood because they knew this is how you honor a man like that. Some placed their hands over their hearts. A few straightened their backs. Even the security guard by the door lifted a salute of his own. Dylan didn't speak. He couldn't. Because in that moment, the lobby of a bank became something else entirely, a place of remembrance, of humility, of overdue gratitude. Colonel Tom Ray hadn't come for recognition. But now that it had found him, every soul in that room understood they were in the presence of something rare, a quiet kind of greatness. And greatness deserves to be seen. When the room finally settled, no one rushed back to business. No one asked Tom Ray to move faster. No one dared speak over the stillness. Tom stepped toward the counter, not with ceremony, not with pride, but with the same steady purpose that had brought him here in the first place. He handed over the required paperwork and softly said, "Just need a withdrawal, enough to help my grandson get through his first year." The teller, hands trembling, processed the transaction in silence. She whispered an apology as she handed him the receipt, but Tom didn't acknowledge it. Not out of anger, he simply didn't need it. Some wounds don't require bandages. They require respect. He folded the slip once, tucked it into his coat pocket, and turned to go. That might have been the end of it. No applause, no cameras, no headlines. But General Hale took a single step forward and placed a firm hand on Tom's shoulder. "Colonel," he said, voice lowered but firm, "you've got 5 minutes." Tom raised a brow, curious. 5 minutes for what? Hale looked around the room. "For the respect you never asked for, but should have been given a long time ago." And once again the room rose. No longer as spectators, but as witnesses to a truth far too long delayed. Tom paused only for a second, then gave a quiet nod, one final salute, not with his hand, but with his presence. Then he walked out into the afternoon light, the door slowly closing behind him. No cameras followed, no interviews waited. But inside that bank, people stood a little straighter, spoke a little softer, looked at each other with eyes a little more aware of the stories that don't always get told. Later that week, a new line was added to the old brass plaque in the bank's lobby just beneath the original dedication to High Point's military past. It read, "Thomas M. Ray, Colonel, U.S. Army, honor and silence." No explanation was needed, because some legacies don't shout, they endure. Some happen in silence, without ceremony, without spotlight, just like the way Colonel Thomas M. Ray lived, and just like the way he walked out of that bank with quiet dignity. He didn't ask for applause, he didn't need validation. But today we remember him, and through him, we remember all those who served and were nearly forgotten. If his story moved you, if you believe men like Tom deserve more than silence, type "honored" in the comments to show your respect. And if you want to help us keep sharing the stories of real heroes, men and women, whose service should never be overlooked, subscribe to the channel and stand with us. Because sometimes the most powerful tribute is simply choosing not to look away.